Paradise Valley, Montana, had faced wildfires before, but nothing like the blaze that roared through it that August afternoon. The dry wind carried embers like bullets, igniting fields and memories without mercy. Eli Barrett stood frozen, his boots buried in ash, watching helplessly as the fire swallowed the barn, the home, the trees his father had planted when Eli was a boy. In a matter of minutes, everything he had built, rebuilt, and fought for was reduced to smoke. Eli fell to his knees, the ground beneath him still warm from the flames. His shoulders slumped under the weight of 30 years of sweat and sacrifice. He had always been the quiet type, steady, strong, but now his hands trembled as he gripped the dirt. The silence around him was deafening, broken only by the creak of a collapsing beam. "It's all gone," he whispered, voice hoarse from smoke and grief. Then came the sound that pulled him back, the slow, steady rhythm of hooves. From behind the wall of smoke emerged Rust, his Mustang. Not a tame barn horse, but a wild one Eli had rescued years ago when most said it couldn't be done. The animal limped, his coat scorched and eyes wide with fatigue. But he was alive. And he had come back. Rust pressed his head gently against Eli's shoulder, as if to say, "We made it." Eli buried his face in the Mustang's neck and wept, not for what he'd lost, but for what remained. For the next few days, Eli barely spoke. He refused to leave Rust's side, even when aid workers offered shelter and help. He slept beneath a tarp beside the horse, surrounded by blackened ruins and the bitter smell of smoke. Neighbors offered to board Rust until Eli got back on his feet. He only shook his head. "He stays with me." The fire had taken his past, but it hadn't taken the one soul that refused to leave him behind. Then came the envelope, hand-delivered by a man in a gray truck who didn't wait around. No return address, no postage. Just Eli Barrett, written in heavy cursive. Inside, a single sheet of paper and a formal-looking document. The letter read, "You don't remember me. But I remember you. And I owe you everything. Meet me where the barn used to be. I have something that belongs to you." Eli stared at the note, a strange tension rising in his chest. The handwriting felt familiar. Too familiar. That night, as darkness fell over the valley and smoke still lingered in the air, Eli sat in the ashes with Rust beside him. The Mustang stood silently, breathing slow and deep, like he was waiting too. Eli's hand rested on the horse's mane as he stared into the night. Whoever had written that letter knew something that could change everything. And deep in Eli's gut, a feeling he hadn't felt in years began to rise. Something was coming. If this story moved you, just wait for what's coming next. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss Chapter 2. Turn on the notification bell and join us on this emotional journey with Eli and Rust. This is just the beginning. Eli returned to the ruins just after dawn, the letter still folded in his jacket pocket, its weight far heavier than the paper itself. The spot where the barn once stood was now a blackened skeleton, beams half sunk in ash, and metal tools twisted by heat. He hadn't told anyone about the message. Part of him wondered if it was a cruel joke. But something inside him, deeper than logic, told him it wasn't. Rust followed close, his limp less pronounced but his ears alert, as if he, too, was waiting for something. The valley was silent, broken only by the distant calls of crows circling the burnt fields. Eli stood still, listening, watching. Time stretched. Then he heard it, footsteps. Not boots, but lighter, purposeful. A figure emerged from behind the scorched tree lean. A woman, maybe in her mid-40s, dressed plainly, her face partially hidden by a wide hat. She moved like someone familiar with pain, with loss. And when her eyes met Eli's, something flickered, recognition. Not joy, not sorrow, something in between. "You don't remember me," she said quietly, removing her hat. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were restless. "Name's Clair." Claire Delaney. The name didn't mean much at first. Eli studied her face. There was something in the way she stood, the way her hands shook just slightly. And then a memory cracked open. A fairground. Summer heat. A teenage girl with sunburned cheeks and two big boots handing him a bottle of water after a rodeo ride gone wrong. Claire. She was the vet's daughter. From the next town over. Why her? Why now? Eli took a step back, confused. That was years ago. What are you doing here? Claire didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a yellowed folder, tied with a piece of twine. You helped someone back then, she said. More than you know. My brother, Cal. He was in trouble. And you stepped in. You didn't even remember his name, did you? Eli said nothing. The truth was, he didn't. But whatever he'd done, it had stayed with her all this time. Claire held out the folder, her hand trembling slightly. He passed away last year. Cancer. Before he died, he told me to find you. Said you had a right to this. Eli took the folder without a word, his fingers brushing hers briefly. Inside was a deed. Land. Acres of it, just north of the ridge. Signed over. To him. His name, in black ink. And a photo of Cal as a boy, sitting on a fence post with a wild young colt. The same colt that would become Rust. Eli's breath caught in his throat. Everything around him, the fire, the ruin, the years of silence, it all narrowed into that one moment. Rust, standing beside him, had come from Cal. The land, now his. A gift, or maybe a burden. Eli didn't know yet. But one thing was clear, the past he thought was lost had just returned. And it had brought secrets with it. Eli stared at the deed in his hands long after Claire had gone. The weight of it didn't come from the paper, it came from what it meant. Land, sure. But also questions. Why had Cal left it to him? They hadn't spoken in decades. And yet, the Mustang standing beside him, the colt in that old photo, it all connected. Rust wasn't just a survivor. He was a living thread tying Eli to a past he had long forgotten, or maybe tried to forget. Back at the tent, Eli spread the contents of the folder out on a makeshift table. Documents, faded photos, handwritten notes. Rust paced nearby, restless, as if sensing the shift in Eli's world. One note in particular caught his eye. Cal had scribbled something on the back of a vet bill from 1997. He saved me when no one else would. I never said thank you. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and Eli deserves to know everything. Know what? The next morning, Eli rode Rust north toward the ridge, to the land Cal had left him. It was rough country, untouched and wild, just like it must have been when Cal first bought it. But there was something else. Tucked between two hills stood an old trailer, rusted and leaning, with a collapsed corral nearby. Eli tied Rust to a fence post and approached slowly, heart pounding like hooves on dry ground. It looked abandoned, but the padlock on the door was new. Inside, dust covered everything. But there were signs of life, stacked papers, old letters, a cracked photo frame on the table. Eli picked it up. Cal, younger, smiling. Beside him, a woman with eyes full of sorrow. And in the background, Eli, younger, confused, standing by a horse trailer. He didn't remember that moment. Not the woman. Not the picture. But there he was. A piece of someone else's story he didn't know he was part of. As the wind howled outside, Eli sat down in the worn chair and opened a tin box he found under the bed. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Claire. None of them sent. Letters filled with apologies, regrets, and one repeated name, Eli Barrett. Some were dated just months ago. Some went back 20 years. And all of them carried the same desperate tone. Cal had been carrying something heavy, and now it was in Eli's hands. Outside, Rust let out a low, uneasy whinny. Eli stepped out quickly and looked toward the ridge, eyes narrowing. A dark truck was parked near the edge of the tree line. Someone was watching. Someone who didn't want this land touched or the past uncovered. Eli didn't move at first. The dark truck stayed parked near the trees, engine idling low, headlights off. Whoever was inside didn't step out, but they didn't leave either. Rust shifted uneasily, ears twitching. Eli rested his hand on the Mustang's neck, calming him, while his own pulse raced. The timing was too perfect. Someone had been watching the land, and now that Eli was here, they were watching him too. After a few minutes, the truck slowly backed up and disappeared down the dirt trail without ever revealing the driver. Eli took a long breath, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. He'd come looking for answers, but he hadn't expected to feel hunted. Inside the trailer, he gathered the letters and documents into his bag. If someone didn't want this story uncovered, he needed to know why, and fast. Back at the tent near his burned ranch, Eli spread the letters across a table. Clair returned just before sundown, drawn by a message he'd left in town. She sat across from him, scanning the notes. Her face paled as she read her brother's words. "He never told me any of this," she murmured. "All these years. I thought he left to get clean. Start over. I didn't know he was watching us from a distance." Eli didn't speak. There were no right words for betrayal that wore the face of love. Claire handed him one of the final letters, dated just weeks before the fire. It mentioned pressure from the banks, land disputes, and someone called Redmond. Eli felt the name drop like a stone in his gut. Carl Redmond was a land developer, slick, powerful, and ruthless. Years ago, Redmond had tried to buy Eli's ranch. When Eli refused, the man backed off, but now he wondered if Redmond's interest had shifted toward Cal's property instead. Later that night, Eli walked the burned edge of his land with Rust following silently. The Mustang paused near a tree stump and sniffed at the ground. Eli knelt and saw it, tire tracks. Not from a fire truck or aid vehicle. Too fresh. Too deliberate. He followed them for several yards before they vanished near the stream. Someone had been trespassing. And not just watching, searching for something. Back in the tent, Eli stared at a map pinned to the plywood wall. His ranch. Cal's land. Redmond's development boundaries. There was overlap, barely noticeable, but enough to explain why someone might want Cal gone or Eli out of the way. The fire, the letter, the land, it was all connected. And for the first time in years, Eli felt something old stir inside him. Not grief. Not confusion. It was resolve. Eli drove into town at first light, the weight of Cal's letters burning a hole in his bag. He didn't bother with breakfast or small talk. He went straight to the county records office. The clerk, an older man who'd known Eli since high school, greeted him with cautious eyes. "You're looking for something," he said. "Or someone." Eli simply nodded and slid over a slip of paper with the name, Carl Redmond. The clerk's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Within minutes, he returned with a folder thick with permits, property transfers, and land surveys. What Eli found chilled him. Redmond had been buying up parcels across the valley for over a decade, slowly, carefully, through shell companies and quiet deals. Cal's land was the last piece between Redmond and a massive development project, a private resort tucked into what was once untouched country. Eli's ranch had blocked it for years, and now, with everything burned to the ground, the path was clear. Too clear. Back at the trailer, Eli walked the land again, this time with intent. Rust moved beside him, ears flicking toward every rustle in the trees. Near the old stream bed, Eli found it, a small orange flag stuck into the ground. Surveyor's tape. Fresh. His stomach turned. Someone had been marking Cal's land, likely assuming no one would check. He yanked the flag free and looked around. The stillness of the valley now felt like a warning. Claire met him there an hour later, her face tense. "I did some digging," she said, holding up her phone. Redmond filed an application last month to claim this land as abandoned. He was banking on no heirs, no will, nothing. But now that you have the deed, he's got a problem. Eli narrowed his eyes. And what does a man like him do with problems? Claire didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, someone cut the fence. Rust's uneasy snorts woke Eli just before 2 a.m. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, his shotgun in hand. The gate was open, swinging in the wind. Rust stood alert, ears forward, but unharmed. No footprints. No tire tracks this time. Just an act of intimidation. A message. Eli closed the gate and leaned against the post, breathing heavy. "They think I'll run," he whispered to Rust. "But not this time." The next morning, Eli did something he hadn't done in years. He saddled Rust. The Mustang was still healing, but strong. Steady. They rode toward Redmond's office on the edge of town, dust rising beneath their hooves like smoke. Eli wasn't just chasing answers anymore. He was walking straight into the fire. Because some men run from the past, and some ride straight through it. Eai, ok você acha que vai acontecer agora? Eli vai conseguir enfrentar Redmond ou essa batalha tá só começando? Quero saber a sua teoria. Comenta aqui embaixo o que você acha que vem por aí, porque essa história ainda não acabou. Redmond's office stood like a fortress on the edge of town. Modern glass, steel corners, and a fresh layer of arrogance painted across every inch. Eli dismounted Rust just outside the gates, letting the Mustang graze near a patch of dry grass. People stopped and stared. A man showing up on horseback wasn't common anymore. But Eli didn't care. He wanted to be seen. He wanted Redmond to know he wasn't afraid. Inside, the receptionist gave him the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Eli met her gaze evenly. "He'll want to see me." She hesitated, then picked up the phone. Minutes later, Eli was walking through glass doors into a room that smelled like money and lies. Carl Redmond stood behind his desk, dressed in a tailored suit, his smirk ready like a weapon. "Mr. Barrett," he said smoothly, "didn't expect to see you. Thought you'd be rebuilding." Eli stepped forward, placing the deed and a copy of Cal's will on the desk. "I know what you're doing. I've seen the maps, the claims, the markers out on the ridge." Redmond didn't blink. He leaned back, folding his arms. "I'm just expanding opportunity. That land was going to waste. Cal wasn't using it. You weren't using yours. No. A fire clears the way for something useful." Eli's jaw clenched. "You call that convenient? A fire that started near the ridge? Right where you need access." Redmond's smile faded, just slightly. "You're accusing me of arson, Eli?" Redmond said, tone sharpening. "Be careful. That's a big word. Dangerous word." Eli leaned in, voice low but steady. "You came after the wrong man. And you didn't count on the Mustang surviving. Or the girl remembering. Or the land having a name on it." Redmond's eyes narrowed. "I can make things difficult for you." Eli gave a half-smile. "They already are." Back at the ridge, Claire was waiting with a county investigator. The night before, she'd contacted someone she trusted, an old friend from veterinary school now working with the state's Rural Property Division. Together, they walked the burned edge of the property. And there it was, a melted gas canister hidden beneath a pile of scrap, buried where no wildfire should have started naturally. It wasn't just suspicion now. It was evidence. As Eli returned, Rust greeted him with a soft nudge. He ran a hand along the Mustang's neck, his thoughts racing. Redmond had power, money, influence. But Eli had the one thing that couldn't be bought, truth. And now, for the first time, he had a way to fight back. The flames hadn't been an accident. They had been a weapon. But the man they tried to break had already lived through worse. The evidence found near the ridge changed everything. The melted gas canister, partially concealed under burned debris, was enough for the county investigator to start an official report. Clair handed over Cal's letters, including those that mentioned Redmond's pressure and veiled threats. "It's circumstantial," the investigator said, "but it's something. And paired with the timing of Redmond's permit requests, it raises questions." Eli didn't say it out loud, but he knew questions weren't enough. Redmond didn't deal in questions. He buried them. That night, Eli didn't sleep. Rust stood beside the tent, unusually still, eyes fixed toward the distant hills. Around 2 a.m., a sound echoed across the land. A car engine, too far to see, but close enough to be deliberate. Minutes later, a pair of headlights blinked once, then disappeared into the trees. A warning. Eli gripped the old rifle beside him and stood up, listening to the wind. "They're watching," he muttered. Rust let out a quiet snort, as if to confirm it. Clair came the next morning, pale and shaken. Someone had broken into her motel room. Nothing was stolen, but her things were clearly searched. Drawers open. Notes moved. "He's trying to scare us," she said, voice tight. But if he was really confident, he wouldn't need to. Eli nodded slowly. Redmond wasn't just trying to bury Cal's legacy, he was trying to erase anyone who remembered it. And now, that included them both. Eli made a decision. If Redmond wanted the land badly enough to burn it, he'd give him a reason to fear its owner. He called the local paper, an old friend of his father still ran it, and offered a story. Not just about the fire, but about the letters, the threats, the development plans. "You sure you want to go public with this?" the editor asked. "You'll be kicking a hornet's nest." Eli looked out the window at the burned hills. "It already stung me." By the next day, the article ran under the headline, "Land, Fire, and Secrets, the Real Story Behind the Barrett Blaze." It spread quickly, online, in print, even picked up by a regional news station. Redmond's office released a carefully worded statement denying involvement, but the pressure was mounting. For the first time, Eli saw fear in Redmond's eyes during a tense run-in at the feed store. "You've made a mistake, Barrett," Redmond whispered on his way out. Eli didn't flinch. "No, you did." That night, Eli sat beside Rust, the Mustang calm beneath the moonlight. He brushed the horse's mane, feeling every tangle, every scar. Rust had faced the fire and returned. So had he. But both knew it wasn't over. Not yet. In the distance, coyotes howled, warning or omen, he couldn't tell. But Eli understood now. This land, this fight, wasn't just about memory or revenge. It was about truth. And the truth was finally catching fire. The article had lit a fuse far beyond what Eli expected. Strangers began showing up at the edge of his property. Some reporters, some just curious. Others came quietly, offering support, sharing stories of how Redmond had done the same to them or their families. It turned out, Cal hadn't been the only one. Eli realized what he was facing wasn't just a man, but a system. And now, he had become the face of resistance. Late one afternoon, as clouds rolled over the valley, a black SUV pulled up near the edge of the burned land. Eli was in the barn frame, rebuilding part of the fencing with Clair and a few neighbors when he noticed it. The windows were tinted, the engine running. No one stepped out. Eli felt the shift in the air. "Get inside," he told Clair quietly. "Now." She didn't argue. Seconds later, a Molotov cocktail arced through the air, shattering near the tarp shelter. Flames erupted fast, too fast. People screamed. Rust reared in panic. Eli ran straight into the smoke, grabbed a water barrel, and doused the fire before it spread to the hay. His hands burned. His eyes stung. But the fire didn't win this time. Not here. Not again. By the time the police arrived, the SUV was long gone. Redmond, of course, denied everything. That night, Rust wouldn't rest. He paced the perimeter, muscles tense, eyes locked on the dark beyond the fence. Eli stood with him, one hand on the Mustang's neck. He felt the tremor in the animal. Fear, yes, but also readiness. Like they both knew the battle wasn't over. "You were born wild," Eli whispered. "And I buried that part of me a long time ago. Maybe it's time I let it out again." Clair returned with news. The investigator had filed for a criminal inquiry. The forensic team confirmed the presence of an accelerant both at the original fire site and the Molotov remains. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was evidence. Real, legal, undeniable. But Eli knew Redmond wouldn't go down quietly. The man had too much at stake, and too many people afraid to speak. Eli sat by the old tree stump near what was once the barn, staring into the horizon. Rust stood nearby, calm now, breathing steady. The valley was quiet, but not at peace. Eli exhaled slowly. He wasn't just fighting for his land, or Cal's memory, or even justice. He was fighting for himself, for the man he used to be, and the man he still had a chance to become. And as the last light of day slipped behind the mountains, he knew the final move was coming. And this time, it would burn clean. The sun rose quiet over the valley, but Eli knew it was only the calm before the storm. The sheriff's department called just after dawn. Redmond had requested a restraining order against Eli, claiming harassment, defamation, and trespassing. A cheap move. Desperate. But it meant one thing. Redmond knew he was cornered. And now, he was trying to flip the story before the truth took root. Clair drove Eli into town. They didn't speak much during the ride. There was nothing left to say, only things left to do. At the courthouse, Eli stood tall as the judge read the request, the accusations, the shallow legal tricks. Then, with calm and clarity, Clair presented the documentation. Cal's letters, the forensic reports, the land deed, the photos, and sworn statements from neighbors who had seen Redmond's men near the ridge before the fire. The judge asked for a recess. There was too much to ignore. Outside, the crowd had grown. Journalists, locals, even old ranchers who hadn't stepped foot off their land in years. Eli wasn't used to being the center of anything, but now his name was on every headline. He stood by Rust, who had been trailered into town and now waited patiently behind the courthouse. A wild horse turned loyal. A man once broken, now standing. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, especially Redmond, who watched from across the street, jaw tight, arms crossed. That afternoon, the sheriff himself came down to Eli's land. Not with a warrant, but with a warning. "Redmond's leaving town," he said. "But he's not backing down. His lawyers will drag this out for months. Maybe years." Eli nodded. "Let them try," he replied. "The truth's already out. You can't burn a story once it's told." The sheriff gave a slow nod. "Just watch your back." Eli returned to the ridge at sunset, where the line between his land and Cal's still held the scent of smoke. He tied Rust to a post and walked alone into the empty trailer one last time. There, he left something behind, a photo of him and Cal as teens, barely remembered until now. A silent offering to a broken friendship, to a brotherhood cut short by time, pride, and pain. "I remember now," Eli whispered, "and I won't forget again." As darkness fell over Paradise Valley, the wind picked up, rustling through the grass like the whispers of the past. The fight wasn't over, but Eli had already won the part that mattered most. He hadn't run. He hadn't surrendered. And the land, scarred and blackened, still stood beneath his boots. Just like him. One last battle was coming. And in the morning, he would be ready to face it, with Rust at his side. The legal storm passed slower than Eli hoped, but the tide had already turned. The state launched a formal investigation into Redmond's land acquisitions. His development permits were suspended. Investors pulled out. By winter, his name had disappeared from the local papers, replaced by stories of rebuilding, resilience, and one man who refused to be silenced. Eli didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. He hadn't fought for attention, he'd fought for truth. And truth had found its way through the smoke. Claire stayed longer than she'd planned. What began as closure for her brother turned into something deeper. She and Eli rebuilt the barn piece by piece, not to restore what was lost, but to create something new, something honest. The new structure was simpler, sturdier. And this time, it had space not just for horses, but for people too. Ranchers, neighbors, and anyone with a story that needed to be heard. Rust healed alongside Eli. His burns faded, his limp all but gone. But what never left was his wildness. Even now, as he galloped across the ridge at dusk, mane snapping in the wind, there was a fire in him no man could ever tame. Eli watched him run and saw himself, not as he had been, but as he had become. Scarred, yes, but free. The Mustang had survived the flames. And so had the man who walked beside him. On the first anniversary of the fire, Eli held a gathering on the land. Dozens came, some who had once doubted him, others who had stood by him from the start. Clair read a letter from Cal out loud, one of the last he had written but never sent. In it, Cal spoke of regret, redemption, and the land he could never fully leave behind. By the end, even the toughest ranchers wiped their eyes. "This place isn't just dirt," Eli said quietly. "It's memory. It's blood. And it's ours to protect." Later that evening, Eli stood alone on the ridge, Rust beside him. The valley stretched out below, golden in the setting sun. The wind carried no smoke now, only peace. Eli ran a hand along Rust's neck and whispered, "We're still standing." The Mustang snorted softly, as if in agreement. The past hadn't destroyed them. It had revealed them. Because in the end, the fire didn't take everything. It took what was weak, what was false, what was already broken. But what mattered most, the bond between man and land, between a wild soul and a quiet heart, that had survived. And now, with nothing left to fear, Eli Barrett finally allowed himself to breathe deep and begin again.